even as a co-organizer, I'm happy to speak here. And yeah, as Betsy already announced, my paper is very complementary to hers. There's going to be a little bit of overlap, but so you'll hear some things we have just heard again, but leading to a bit of a different argument. On 15 December 1928, about 10 months before his untimely death, the 63-year-old A.B. Warburg asked for his tailcoat to be sent to Rome by express mail. Since it was decades old, he wrote, no problems with customs were to be expected. Warburg was preparing for his last, or if we follow Matthew earlier this morning, maybe not quite his last, public lecture held from 5:30 to 7:30 on Saturday, 19 January 1929, in a newly renovated Studiensaal at the Palazzo Zuccari in the heart of Rome. Since 1913, this late 16th century palace had been the seat of the Bibliotheca Hertziana, a member institute of the German Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft. Ernst Steinmann is director and author of some of the popular Knackfuß Künstlermonographien, among them the 1897 volume Ghirlandaio, had invited Warburg to speak, and he chose as his subject, I quote, and we have heard it several times, Roman antiquity in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio. And here we see the invitation card to his audience. Warburg addressed an audience of about 100 scholars, aware, owing to a heart condition, that he had little time left to promote the results of a lifetime of research. Here we have got a bit of an impression of, we saw the images already, how the panels looked he used, and I won't repeat the part about which Betsy sort of explained in so well just now in her lecture, what the actual lecture looked like. Most of his lecture, Warburg's commentary on the works of the eponymous Florentine goldsmith and painter Domenico Ghirlandaio, based on some 150 reproductions on the large middle three screens of the panorama of 7, had not been written up. Warburg extemporated, delivering it spontaneously. And I repeat the images of these, like after the Sansani photographs, of these middle screens, which I'm going to talk about in the next 30 minutes. And we see already, perhaps worth reiterating, that they look much more, so they were photographed to look much more like book plates already. So they don't have the large horizontal screens anymore, but Sansani turned them into, so not the vertical, we now have the horizontal format and the white background. The so-called central chapter of the Atlas, the Atlas project, presented on 19 January in Rome, had been in the making for more than 30 years, that is, since the late 1890s. In a loose manner, Warburg spoke of, quote, unquote, 30 years of pre-work, and freely admitted that his work was not at an end. His audience was explicitly given the impression of attending a workshop, if not a masterclass, where they were observing the master putting the final touches on his last major piece. They saw him in action, actively demonstrating complex interconnections between juxtaposed images and, like an actor, reciting iconographically relevant historical texts. Hans Warburg's workshop metaphor was twofold. It described both the interactive performance lecture and an essential aspect of its subject, Domenico Ghirlandaio's workshop practice, that is using copies drafted after Roman antiquities as iconographical formulas for new inventions. 2 sketchbooks with such drawings furnished proof of Ghirlandaio's and other Florentine artists' studies of Roman antiquities. the Codex Escorialensis, whose drawings were attributed to Ghirlandaio's circle by Hermann Egger in his first edition of the Codex of 1905 and 6, and the Codex Barberianus, attributed to Giuliano da Sangallo. In the following, I want to demonstrate that this apparently minor aspect of Warburg's wide-ranging Hertziana lecture, an aspect he had already addressed as a student at Bonn in an outline of 6 September 1889 for his doctoral dissertation as Archäologisierende Richtung, is indeed the point of departure for the summa of his scholarly life. Why did Warburg, in his title, emphasize one single, distinctly archaeological aspect of his much broader work on Quattrocento Florentine art? The lecture's prehistory, namely the Demonstrationsabend of 5 December 1928, might hold the answer to this. And I won't repeat what happened on that evening because it was so nicely described by Betsy just now. So we have already heard that impressed by Warburg's argument, and we see the whole setup again. So impressed by Warburg's argument, the archaeologist Ludwig Curtius asked him to repeat the talk for his students. Warburg liked the idea. Just as in 1905, when he conveyed similar ideas to classical philologists and archaeologists, he wanted to teach fellow scholars of a neighboring discipline his, quote, combined method. This term, repeatedly used, was a synonym for the mutual explication of contemporary texts of various kinds and images of likewise various nature, to understand certain period mentalities that shaped iconographies. He thus told Curtius he was planning, quote, an anatomical demonstration of the methodology of the science of art. And his old friend and colleague Robert Davison that he wanted to demonstrate what insights, quote, linking archaeology with art history can offer in terms of methodology. Then in his introduction to the lecture, he expressed indeed his belief that in the, quote, fruitfulness of a mutual recognition of archaeology, art history, and a sociologically precise historical science. After having coined and used the term Italian antiquity in 1905 and 1926 respectively, now in Rome he decided to fashion his most original recurring theme developed over 3 decades as Roman antiquity. And now we move back to the early 1900s. In October 1897, newly married, Warburg had moved with his wife Mary to Florence. Under some pressure by his family to come up with a qualifying major art historical study and join the academic community, but struggling with his long-standing, theoretically ambitious work on the formation of symbols, the 31-year-old Warburg resumed the research he had begun in 1894-95 in Florentine archives. In this year, he had been browsing the collection systematically, searching descriptions of 15th century festivals whose relevance as sources he had recognized during research for his doctoral dissertation. Warburg was a great admirer of the eminent Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt, whom he also mentioned in his introduction to the Hertziana lecture. In his seminal Die Kultur der Renaissance in Italien of 1860, Burckhardt had stated that, quote, religious, moral, and poetical ideas took visible shape in the festival as a higher phase in the life of the people, unquote. And he concluded that festivals, quote, in their higher form are true transition from real life into the world of art, end of quote, implying that when it came to such feasts and festivals, everybody was equal. The term higher alludes to the overcoming of class differences by the so-called absolute individual. Burckhardt thus interpreted festivals as a self-reflected phenomenon, in the words of Peter Berg, as a type of popular culture. If they reflected indeed both religious and secular values of a society, Warburg then concluded, the depiction must be a gauge for the mentality of the people who created them. Subsequently, in the late 1890s, he set out to match such depictions, often commissioned by affluent Florentine merchants, with any available record referring to them. Prominent fresco cycles, which Warburg called image chronicles, and popular pieces of decorative arts, cassoni and deschi da parto, became his focus. So I now move, in the next part of my paper, I move to a mode in which you always see one of the central chapter panels or plates on the right side, or almost always compared to what I'm speaking about with regard to his research in the early 1900s. By this route, Warburg became interested in Domenico Ghirlandaio's decoration of the main chapel of Santa Maria Novella, the major Dominican church in Florence. A large narrative cycle of the lives of Mary and St. John the Baptist, painted between 1885 and 1890, commissioned by the influential banker Giovanni Tornabuoni. So that is the cycle. John Ruskin, still much read around 1900, had called these paintings dry, and Bernard Berenson, whom Warburg regarded as a style sniffer, found Ghirlandaio mediocre. Yet Warburg considered the Tornabuoni frescoes, if not quite ingenious, unquestionably highly authentic cultural witnesses. In his Cicerone of the 1850s, Burckhardt remarked, quote, "The most striking thing here," relating to the frescoes, "was the dignified, loftily impressive picture of life, a glorification of actual life in Florence," end of quote. Through Vasari's lengthy vita of Domenico Ghirlandaio, both Burckhardt and Warburg knew which members of the Tornabuoni family were supposedly portrayed by Ghirlandaio. The paying patrons, as it were, had placed their likenesses close to the high altar, themselves featuring in the biblical stories. Warburg called them participants in a biblical or religious play, a sacra rappresentazione, and made it his task to identify all members of the Consorteria Tornaquinci Tornabuoni so as to understand the patron's reason for choosing certain iconographies. An earlier preparatory drawing, we see it here, for the Annunciation to Zacharias in the life of St. John, with the inscribed names of the individuals to be portrayed, was known. The drawing held at the Albertina in Vienna records an earlier design in which Warburg saw a possible allusion to a thanks offering rite connected with childbirth. In order to understand who is who, he drew family trees, among others also the famous one later displayed on panel A of the Bilderatlas. We see it here in the original. And here we see some others of his attempts to draw trees and identify the figures. You see it on the right side in the frescoes. Warburg revealed the first results of his research in the fictive poetical exchange of two letters with his friend André Jolles, the Ninfa Fiorentina, or fragment of the Nymph of 1900-1901, conceived as a kind of theoretical manifesto. And here we see more of his attempts to figure out who is who on the frescoes. In its position on panel A, the tree stands for Warburg's very own new methodology, the already quoted combined method, also called combined historical method, of the study of texts, either contemporary registries, chronicles, treatises, or literary works, to elucidate both the facts and the mentalities that counted for the choice of certain images. Why did Warburg speak of a religious play? Apparently he linked the frescoes to versifications alla casalinga, so housewife style, as he called them, of biblical stories, and we see the manuscript here on the panel, by Lucrezia Tornabuoni, the sister of Giovanni, wife of Piero de' Medici and mother of Lorenzo il Magnifico. Some art historians think she too is portrayed in the cycle. Among her popular religious narrative poems, first published in the year 1900, is the life of St. John with a description of the feast of Herod, as depicted by both Ghirlandaio and 30 years earlier, around the time Lucrezia wrote her Rime Sacre by Filippino Lippi. An edition of Lucrezia Tornabuoni's Rime was going to be included in a source volume, part of the projected multi-volume Mnemosyne publication, which again Betsy Sears just mentioned. But Warburg noticed something even more interesting. Through Eugène Münz, he had learned that Hippolyte Taine, in his Voyage en Italie of 1900 again, called the figure, already admired by Vasari, of the striding maid with a basket of fruit who enters St. Elizabeth's bedchamber, une nymphe antique. Dressed à l'antica with open hair, sandals, a fluttering garment and veil, she not only resembled the nymphs frequently evoked by Ovid and descriptions of such creatures in records of 15th century festivals. When Egger's edition came out in 1905, Warburg found a model on folio 51 of the Codex Escurialensis. For him, the nymph was, metaphorically, an unwinged modern victory, a symbol of overcoming Christian doctrine. The latter specifically since the early church had banned a statue of victory from Rome. It was then his own discovery that Ghirlandaio had indeed copied a victory of the 1st century AD, placing her in a small fictive bas-relief on the same Annunciation to Zacharias. His model, still visible on the Arch of Constantine, was the victory who crowns the Emperor Trajan after the battle. Warburg concluded that if the victory was copied en grisaille and the Nympha had brought classicizing movement into a static scene, Ghirlandaio's murder of the innocents on the opposite wall, even if following the scriptural account, had been preceded by the pathos-laden drama detectable on the same Arch of Constantine. It would shortly later make its mark on the style of Raphael and his followers. This new kind of mixed artwork, visibly inspired by the pre-Christian models, Warburg convinced himself, was a gateway for the so-called entry of animated figurations that explicitly quote the imagery of pagan antiquity. And he believed that the patrons of such works, who liked to compare themselves to their ancient Roman ancestors, were likewise self-conscious thinkers who enjoyed more liberal attitudes than expected in a morally controlled society. To illustrate this point, Warburg used to quote Savannah Rolla, namely his condemnations of images of loosely dressed women. In his sermons of 1496, Savonarola called them pure vanity to be banned from churches. At the Arziana lecture, he imitated Savonarola, as we've now heard twice, and to such perfection that, as an eyewitness Kenneth Clark remembers, that one felt that one could hear the frate's high, thin, passionate voice ringing in the vaults of the Duomo. That was Clark's quote. In December 1900, when searching for original documents relating to Giovanni Tornabuoni's commission of the Santa Maria Novella frescoes, Warburg purportedly found proof that another banker, Francesco Sassetti, trying to secure rights to the same chapel, had been refused owing to a dispute with the Dominican monks. Later scholarship has corrected Warburg's find as a misunderstanding, but he set out to investigate the concurrent commission, the Cappella Sassetti in Santa Trinita, as a document of Sassetti's particular tastes and character. Remarkably, this fresco cycle had been executed earlier, namely from 1880 to 1885, by the same Ghirlandaio. Devoted to Sassetti's patron saint, St. Francis of Assisi, the program has features obviously similar to the later Tournabuoni cycle. Firstly, the depiction of a holy legend, here the legend of St. Francis, observed by members of the patron's family and his cycle, including Lorenzo de' Medici. Secondly, a tomb designed all'antica with grisaille motifs after Roman imperial coins by Ghirlandaio, and a lamentation scene, probably created by Giuliano da San Gallo after a Meleager sarcophagus, documented in the Codex Coburgensis. We see images of all these discoveries. Most of Warburg's energy, however, was spent on identifying the portraits of Lorenzo de' Medici's children and their tutors, depicted in the lunette as if they were entering a stage where the confirmation of the rule of St. Francis is performed. Spurred by Vasari's claim that Ghirlandaio, quote Vasari, as a goldsmith would draw a portrait of all who passed the shop producing a likeness in a second, of this we still have proof in an infinite number of portraits in his work which show a most lifelike resemblance. He, Warburg, went on to make meticulous comparisons with named portraits of individuals from Lorenzo's circle. To his brother Max, he wrote on 30 November 1900 that this apparently dry work would get tremendously interesting if one succeeded in reviving artworks, and that he just realized he had learned the method he applied by means of a chess problem, a Schachaufgabe, he frequently had to solve when he was a schoolboy. Distinct from the Tournabuoni frescoes, Ghirlandaio's earlier commission contains stylistic elements which clearly pointed to Flemish origin. Like Jan van Eyck's Jodocus fights on the Ghent altarpiece, Sassetti kneels in adoration of the altar. The panel painting of the adoration itself, the chapel's altarpiece, features another possibly archaeologically correct relic from the past, a sarcophagus used as a crypt, or alluded to being a crypt, a symbol of overcoming paganism. In the early 1900s, Warburg saw Ghirlandaio mainly as one of the most important representatives of a critical period of transformation in 15th century style. The result was a classicizing, in Warburg's words, idealizing style associated with Raphael and Michelangelo. In these years, he was trying to write up his radical new ideas about its genesis, that is, a so-called battle of styles under the influence of imported Flemish artworks, as an alternative to the narrative of the geniuses and their workshops. In this context, he addressed Ghirlandaio's workshop for the first time in a lecture in 1909. For Warburg, the workshop praxis was not copying the master, but copying from antique monuments and reusing these kinds of set pieces in one's own inventions. Ghirlandaio was an interesting case for Warburg, as he had been able to produce a whole range of different styles, putatively reflecting various stages of emotion. He describes this as, on the one hand, the imitation of a calm, introverted atmosphere, the realism of the Flemish altarpieces, which affluent patricians in Florence were keen to own and display, as well as his abilities as a portraitist, and on the other hand, as seen in his latest phase, the ecstatic frenzy of violent scenes of pursuit and killing, or the focusing on a single agitated figure to create dramatic tension. Ghirlandaio thus wasn't for Warburg a trendsetter, but a painter who observed and reacted. This made him an authentic representative of a period of artistic tension. Warburg kept stressing that style was not a formalistic, but a psychological phenomenon. In this respect, Ghirlandaio's paintings were just a mirror of Sassetti's and Tornabuoni's minds, and he an artist of balances and compromises. Much of Warburg's Kulturwissenschaft is based on Burckhardt's original idea that festivals are, quote again, a higher phase in the life of the people. A higher phase which he transformed into his own more comprehensive concept of bewegtes Leben, life in movement and life in motion. That is, in Warburg's interpretation, physical motion and psychological emotion. Studying the rituals of the indigenous Indians in New Mexico and Arizona in 1896, he believed he had finally understood how both emotion and motion materialized in the creation of symbols. In his very own terms, he called the symbol Umfangsbestimmung, determination of scope or outline. The multifaceted term bewegtes Leben features in almost every one of the trial titles for the Bilderatlas Mnemosyne. And since he began his scholarly career with discovering the odd phenomenon of animation in the inanimate in Quattrocento art, was a leitmotif of Warburg's research. Already when working on his doctoral dissertation, he wanted to understand the expression of emotion, both anthropologically and psychologically, in relation to expression in art. Reiterating which of the relevant theorists, Darwin, Piderit, Robert Fisher, Simon, and others he studied, and what conclusions he derived from them, is beyond the scope of this paper. But it is worth remembering that he isolated for his own reflections the figure of the Nymph, Ghirlandaio and others, seeing her as an incarnation of this emotion, a kind of symbol. Prototypically invented by ancient sculptors, this female, dressed all'antica, striding, dancing either harmoniously or ecstatically, or in extreme cases even killing, and recurring throughout the history of expression in Western culture, was to serve him as proof for his assumptions. Ghirlandaio's maid was with a fruit basket, subject of the Nymph Fiorentina of 1900-1901, thus became a pivot of Warburg's life project. She was not just a historical phenomenon, but also a test case for his so-called historical psychology, a gorge to demonstrate that in the lead-up to the High Renaissance, both patrons and artists had, on one hand, increasingly empathized with the expressions of their ancient predecessors, and on the other, instinctively came up with the very same expressions to depict more and more dramatic emotions. From Warburg's published and unpublished writings, such as the famous Nymph Fiorentina, a cycle of 3 lectures on Ghirlandaio delivered in Hamburg in 1901, the slim book on portraiture, Bildniskunst of 1902, explicitly promoted as alternative to Steinmann's Ghirlandaio in the Knackfuß series, and his essay on Ghirlandaio's last injunctions to his sons of 1907, we know how he approached the program of the Sassetti and Tornabuoni chapels. In his 1907 essay, Warburg reworked his third Ghirlandaio lecture of 1901, refocusing on one historical document, Francesco Sassetti's last injunctions to his son of 1888, which he read as a reflection of the banker's supposedly typical character. Warburg recognized 2 distinct sides of Sassetti's personality, a so-called polarity. On one hand, the devout Christian, and on the other hand, the proud Roman, who through classical Roman models alluded to his virtues. Warburg called him a devout pagan, stressing the mentality of a modern merchant who is confident enough to grab his fortune. He argued that for such a character, the motto or allegory of the goddess Fortuna with a veil or Occasio with a forelock seemed appropriate. We see them again here on the panel. Yet through working on the topic to the end of his life, Warburg never succeeded in publishing his ideas on the Cappella Tornabuoni in depth. So in January 1901, it came to the abrupt ending of his playful exchange with Jolles, intended to help Warburg to express his methodological notions. The failure to finish this piece was indicative. In the same year, he abandoned the plan to write a fourth lecture on Tournabuoni as a patron for his lecture series in Hamburg. Instead, he dedicated a few pages of his third lecture to the frescoes. In 1907, as he was preparing to take over a lectureship in Bonn, he now announced to his colleague Paul Klemen, clearly encouraged by Egger's 1905 and 6 edition of the Codex Escurialensis, that his habilitation would be dedicated to, quote, Ghirlandaio and antiquity. It was never finished, but substantial lectures on the very same subject followed in 1909 and in 1914. Neither materialized as chapters of the so-called Big Book Warburg was still hoping to complete either. The book project, going back to his early theoretical work and steadily over the years becoming ever more comprehensive, can be called the starting point of the 1920s Bilderatlas project. Interestingly, Warburg's just mentioned 1914 lecture, entitled The Entry of the Idealizing Classical Style and the Painting of the Early Renaissance, delivered at the wake of World War I in Florence, was subsequently written up together with Fritz Sachsel, who had just joined Warburg as a cataloger of his collection of photographs. So all this in 1914. As in the case of Warburg's seminal book on Luther and imagery during the German Reformation, the aim of the joint effort was to turn a lecture into a text for print. A plan in 1914, almost immediately and completely thwarted by the outbreak of the war. And I've jumped this one photograph of the most important, I think, publication for the concept of Ghirlandaio and his workshop. So I conclude. In December 1928, Warburg, his wife Mary, and Sachsel exchanged a number of letters about sending Warburg's earlier text on Ghirlandaio down to Rome. He gave advice as where they were likely to be kept. They struggled to find them. He got angry. At last, everything was found and sent. First and foremost, the lecture essay of 1914. In this print-ready manuscript, published by Bing for the first time in 1966 in Italian, we have the closest possible authorized commentary, the materials that might have served to create explanations for the plates relating to Ghirlandaio and Warburg's Hertziana lecture, plates he regarded as a Hauptkapitel of the Atlas. From the extant typed introduction, we know his main concern were the different influences on Ghirlandaio's style, Roman antiquity and Flemish art, described as the two poles between which the painter was constantly trying to mitigate. In my paper, I have merely offered a glimpse to what a close reading of the panels might yield. One could go further and deeper and also compare the plates with the last version of the Bilderatlas Mnemosyne to rediscover most of the pictures right at the center of the series on panels 42 to 48. And I'm showing only a few examples. The panels 43, 44, and 48, always compared to the Sassetti panel of the Hertziana lecture. Apparently, Warburg kept grappling with the self-imposed task to turn the various aspects he had isolated in Ghirlandaio's oeuvre into one single narrative. Perhaps the biggest hurdle preventing its completion, yet the most desired goal of the Atlas project, was to convey his method. Thank you very much.